A good night of Shabbos. Today is Beis Nissen, the 29th anniversary of the passing of my father, Jacob Yaakov Aryeh Bergstein, Jacob Bergstein of blessed memory. And in his honor, I'd like to talk about the Parsha and connect the Parsha with current events. What's on everybody's mind is the coronavirus. Virus is a tiny little thing. It's very, very small. A bunch of molecules that are able to infect the person, to bring the person to reproduce whatever the virus is composed of. And in the process, when it's a very dangerous virus, it attacks certain parts of the body that are necessary for the function of the body, and the person ceases to live. This particular virus is mostly attracted to the cells of the lungs. Apparently, the lung cell has a certain affinity toward, at least the virus finds an affinity toward the lung cells, and people die from shortness of breath and the deterioration of their lungs. And this is horrific. My son-in-law, Rabbi Sholem Dave Ber Efson, just lost his father this week, Sunday morning. He was my age, an accomplished Rav, Dayan of a city in Great Britain, Leeds, was in relatively good health, good condition, good shape. Within a short period of time, had shortness of breath, and he could not be saved. Well, this is horrific. And the question is, what is it that we're supposed to do? It's a killer that is unseen, unfelt. You don't become sick right away. And at first, you don't think of it as a very, very difficult illness. As it progresses through you, it takes hold of you and can destroy you. This is very similar to the characteristics of ego and selfishness. Every one of us has ego, but we don't have destructive egos. Our egos are tempered by the fact that we like to get along. We want people to like us. We don't want to be criticized in public. Every one of us has a certain sense of shame. And as a result, we don't have a destructive ego. It may be destructive to us, but it could also help us in motivating us to reach higher levels. But when an ego is uncontrolled, you don't even feel within yourself that there is something wrong. And you place yourself above everyone else. And in the process, do incredible damage to others. The coronavirus is subtle. You can't feel it. It's there, and it's doing its job quietly without you noticing. Very, very similar to the selfishness and the ego of a person who's totally self-focused. What happens to a person when, as a result of his attitude, causes damage, harm? So the answer is you have to change. You have to ask forgiveness. So this week's Parsha deals with people who did things that were wrong, sometimes to themselves, sometimes to God, sometimes to other people. What is it that you have to do? Well, you got to first of all, you got to admit it. You got to admit that there's something wrong. And then you have to offer sacrifice. Nowadays, of course, we don't have physical sacrifices. Our prayers are in place of the sacrifices. But when a person is willing to stand before God and stand before God's people and say, I sinned, I made an error, that goes a long way in the process of correction, of correcting the person's imbalances, emotional imbalances. So now, in this week's Parsha, yesterday and today's readings, we find that there's an order, there's a pecking order. Despite the fact that certain people are more powerful than others, there's certain people whose sin is more powerful than others. The first one that's mentioned in the Torah is the high priest. The high priest is the paradigm of virtue. He's the one that's supposed to pray on our behalf. He's the one who's supposed to set the tone for the conduct of people. When you see the high priest, you see godliness, you see purity, you see holiness, you see values, you see a higher purpose. After the high priest, you have the king, the leader. The leader must also be introspective. And only after the leader do we deal with the judiciary, do we deal with the high court. If the high court causes people to make an error, this is the ultimate tragedy, that the people themselves have fallen into a decadent behavior. And as a result, the high court, the ones that issued those verdicts that caused the people to err, they must offer a sacrifice. They must come before God and say, the people didn't do it. It's not the fault of the society. It's our fault. We have erred. So the first thing is, who is the high priest of today? Who are the ones that have to beat their chest and say, we sinned, we have erred? It's the media. The media must understand that they have taken for themselves the mantle of that which is correct. The media claims to speak in the names of others, but more important than that, the media has claimed the mantle of virtue, the mantle of ideals, the mantle of what man should focus on, what should be the purpose of our endeavors. The media has granted itself the title that they are the priests and the high priests of the greater Western society and the greater society in general. And the first sacrifice, the first mea culpa, has to be the media. What is the media engaged in? It's engaged in hatred. It doesn't make a difference whom they hate. They hate anyone who disagrees with them. And they're jealous. They're jealous at the power and the prestige of those who are successful, who aren't among their minions. They are the first who have to beat their chests and come before God and say, God, we have sinned. We need to change. The second, of course, is the leadership, the material leadership. And the Torah tells us, fortunate is the generation where the leaders admit their sins. I know the president doesn't admit his, not openly, because it's very hard for a leader to admit he or she was wrong. But the second mea culpa has to be the leadership of the country. We did not assess, we did not understand, we did not give it our all. But then comes the ones who influence the actions of the community. And that is the Supreme Court, the court systems. The court system in our country have caused the deterioration of not only morality, but the value of life in our country. And it is they who, I believe, are to blame for the disintegration of not only the country's values, but whatever tragedies may befall the country. Spiritually, I lay at their feet. I talked about in a previous video. I believe that it's directly connected to our lack of appreciating life. It started in China. China is the place where they murdered babies, continue to murder babies, where the abortion is forced, where tens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people have died in forced labor camps and other horrific places. The number one place where there is the COVID-19 is now New York City. The number one state in the union that has the most cases by far is New York State. You got to ask yourself, why is New York, which is further from China, why does New York have so many more cases than California, where they're more open? And the answer to you is, in my opinion, New York's abysmal abortion laws that permit not just abortion on demand, but any time, even in the last trimester. Mr. Como, you have to klap al chet. And the Supreme Court that permitted this outrage has to klap al chet. Roe versus Wade is not defined law. Roe v. Wade is an expression of the desires of women to do what men have done. Have their cake and eat it. Have their sex and not suffer consequences. But the result is murder. And when you can kill your own baby, you have no compunction of killing somebody else's baby. And it leads to an indifference to death, especially for the old and infirmed, which is what we have today. The majority of those who die from the COVID-19 are the elderly. So, why has God allowed this? Not a question. God causes everything. Sometimes he causes things to right themselves. Sometimes he causes things so that people look back and think, what is my purpose in life? Is it just to eat and drink, have a good time, make a lot of money, put a lot of assets away for the next generation? Well, now it's stopping. The economy of the world is very critical. It could collapse. and our focus on silliness, on sports, and on other things, that's coming to an end because we realize we can live without it. So what should we do? Spend our time, first and foremost, learning who we are, learning who our families are, learning what the purpose of life is. And then trying to find a cure. And here is what I want to tell you. The president touted an old medicine as a possible game changer. Chloroquine and hydroxychloroquene. And it wasn't just because there was a small test in France or an indeterminate test in China. Quietly, there's some people who've been using chloroquine in New York City. But as soon as the president opened his mouth, the entire media tried to destroy this idea that there could be a cure with hydroxychloroquine, with a Z-Pack. And it mattered not that a doctor came up on Sean Hannity's program and said he had treated about 500 people. Not a single one of them had to go to the hospital, not a single death out of the 500. His name is Vladimir Zelenka. He is a Hasidic doctor out of Kiryat Yoel, where the Satmar Chassidim live, about 35,000 of them. And some of the people in Satmar are upset with him for focusing on Kiryat Yoel because they can't get the gas pump because people are afraid of them. Too bad. Vladimir Zelenka is a straight shooter. Tells it as it is. Most of the people in Kiryat Yoel are probably infected, and probably 90% of them will become infected. That's just the reality. If you have 60% already infected, you'll eventually infect from the 40% that's left, at least 30% of them. So what is Vladimir Zelenka doing about it? He has a collapse. He has a lung that's missing from surgery for his cancer. His office is still dispensing medicine. He's still running his office from his home. And he has treated close to 500 people. And people say, he has been debunked. The people have disproven what he said. He shouldn't be saying what he's saying. You know why they're saying that? A, because this is what Trump said. B, because the guy has a longer beard than mine. And he looks like Tevye. You know, Tevye the Milchiker, the guy out of, Fiddler on the Roof. He looks like that character. He's an authentic Jew saying that he cured people with hydroxychloroquine as azithromycin. So how can I talk about this when I'm an ignoramus? Yeah, you're right, I'm an ignoramus when it comes to medicine. But I have children who have had COVID-19. And 3 of them have had it pretty bad. My daughter and her husband, Hadassah and Rabbi Werner, and my other daughter, Rebbetzin Dubba Weber, out of Huntington Valley in Pennsylvania. All 3 of them received hydroxychloroquine with a Z-Pack, somehow or other. My daughter Dubba had a case of pneumonia while she was about to deliver her 8th child. She was hospitalized. She needed oxygen. and she tested positive for COVID-19. She asked for and she got a prescription for hydroxychloroquene with azithromycin and the zinc. And 2.5 days later, 3 days later, she walked out of that hospital having delivered more than an 8-pound baby. She still can't hold her baby for a while because she is COVID-19 positive. But there is no danger to her life. She doesn't need oxygen. Is this just a coincidence? Or has this happened more than 500 times under the treatment of Dr. Zelenka? You be the judge, and you have to understand that the first people who have to issue a mea culpa, but they never do, they never say they were wrong, but the first people who have to say that they were wrong and admit it are the editors and the news anchors and the commentators on all the liberal media, because they hate, unfortunately, they hate the president, and as a result are willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands and maybe tens of thousands of people because of the hysteria that they like to foment. I'm not saying that hydroxychloroquene is a magic drug. What I'm saying is that it helped my children. And they're typical of the cases that Vladimir Zelenka has talked about. And people should listen before they criticize.